R. Lee Ermey put the fear of God into millions of people as Gunnery Sergeant Hartman in Full Metal Jacket, and for years after, fans couldn't stop asking the same question: how much of that was actually him? The rumors ran hot for decades. Did Ermey see real combat in Vietnam, or did he spend the war safely away from the front lines? Was the shrapnel story something his publicist dreamed up, or did that man genuinely carry metal fragments in his body until the day he died? Did he actually hold the rank people called him, or was Gunny just a movie title that audiences decided to make permanent? These weren't idle questions for casual fans. For people who served, they mattered deeply. When Ermey died on the 15th of April 2018 in Santa Monica, California, at the age of 74, those questions finally started getting real answers. His family spoke up. The United States Marine Corps confirmed details that had been vague for years. Service records, decorations, and documented medical history all came to the surface, and what they revealed was a story far more layered than even most of his admirers had expected. Before any of that came to light, though, Ermey was simply a Marine who didn't talk much about the war. That quiet was a big part of the problem. Silence invites speculation, and the internet is never short of people willing to fill a gap with their own version of the truth. Long before Full Metal Jacket turned him into a household name, Ermey spent more than 3 decades building a screen career, playing exactly the kind of man he had once actually been. Soldiers, drill instructors, tough-as-nails authority figures who didn't take grief from anyone. He was convincing in every single one of those roles, but nothing came close to Gunnery Sergeant Hartman. Stanley Kubrick's 1987 film gave him a stage that fit him perfectly, and he used every inch of it. The performance was staggering. He moved through those barracks scenes with a rhythm and ferocity that felt less like acting and more like memory. Audiences who had never set foot near a military base walked out of that theater absolutely certain that what they'd watched wasn't performance, it was biography. In a lot of ways, they were right. The man had worn the uniform. He had shipped out to a real war zone. He had come home carrying physical damage from that experience, damage that stayed with him for the rest of his life. But he almost never talked about any of it publicly, and that restraint is what opened the door for years of doubt. When journalists pushed him on the subject, Ermey had a way of redirecting the conversation without being rude about it. He once described his reluctance to discuss combat by comparing it to asking someone whose entire family died in a car accident to sit down years later and walk you through every detail of that crash. The pain doesn't shrink just because time passes. That kind of quiet is something many combat veterans understand without needing it explained. But to outside observers, it read as evasion. Online, evasion gets a very specific treatment. Forum threads multiplied. Comment sections filled up with theories. Fan pages started raising pointed, sometimes genuinely hostile questions. Was Ermey a rear echelon Marine who lucked into a career playing warriors because he had the right jawline and the right bark? Was the shrapnel story a piece of carefully crafted Hollywood mythology, cooked up by someone in a studio publicity department? Did he ever actually earn the rank that the whole world called him by? Or did Gunnery Sergeant simply travel home with him from the set of a Kubrick film and never leave? These were the questions hanging in the air when he died, and the answers, when they finally came, told a story worth knowing in full. His death was confirmed by his longtime manager, Bill Rogan, who cited complications from pneumonia as the cause. Within hours, tributes started pouring in from actors, directors, and military veterans across the country. But something else began taking shape in the months and years that followed, something quieter and more deliberate than the wave of public mourning. Official military records, statements tied to his family, and direct confirmations from the Marine Corps itself slowly assembled a picture of a service history that was more layered, more painful, and in many ways far more impressive than anything the internet had ever circulated about him. What follows is a thorough account of what has actually been confirmed, drawn from documented records, first-hand interviews, and statements from people who genuinely knew the man. No embellishment, no Hollywood gloss, just the facts, in order, as they actually happened. To understand R. Lee Ermey, you can't start with Full Metal Jacket. You can't even start with the Marine Corps. You have to go back much further, to a small farm on the outskirts of Kansas City, long before anyone in Hollywood or the military had ever heard his name. R. Lee Ermey was born on the 24th of March, 1944, in Emporia, Kansas, the third of 6 children. For the first 14 years of his life, that farm was his entire world. It was physical, demanding work, the kind of upbringing that doesn't leave much room for softness. In 1958, the family picked up and relocated to Zillah, Washington, a small agricultural town where life wasn't dramatically different. It wasn't a glamorous childhood by any stretch, but it was one that built a certain kind of toughness in him early on. Not that Ermey channeled that toughness in particularly productive directions during his teenage years. He had repeated run-ins with local law enforcement, the kind that didn't stay as warnings for long. By the time he was 17 years old, he had already been arrested twice on criminal mischief charges. This stretch of his life tends to get quietly glossed over in the warm tributes written after his passing, but it shouldn't be, because it's precisely the moment that redirected everything. A judge looked at this repeat offender and gave him 2 options: prison or the military. That was it. It's the kind of dramatic pivot point that screenwriters dream up, except this one actually happened, in a real courtroom, to a real kid who was one bad decision away from a very different life. Ermey chose the Marine Corps, and he officially enlisted in 1961. What followed was more than a decade of service that would come to shape not just who he was as a person, but the entire arc of his public life, including the parts that unfolded on film sets years down the road. His early years in uniform were as unglamorous as his childhood. New recruits don't walk in and get handed responsibility. Ermey started out working in aviation support, learning the structure and discipline of military life from the ground up. But it was his next assignment that would quietly define everything else that came after. Between 1965 and 1967, he served as a drill instructor at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego. That posting, more than any other single experience in his life, became the foundation of his entire acting career, though nobody standing on that parade deck in 1965 could have possibly predicted it. Think about what that job actually involves. Every morning, before most of the civilian world has opened its eyes, you're standing in front of a group of 18-year-old recruits who still think and move and react like civilians. Your job is to dismantle that entirely and rebuild it into something the Corps can use. Ermey did that, day after day, year after year, with genuine authority and without a single camera pointed at him. He wasn't performing, he was doing the real thing, long before Stanley Kubrick ever came calling. After his time as a drill instructor wrapped up, Ermey was posted overseas to Okinawa, Japan, where he served at Marine Corps Air Station Futenma with Marine Wing Support Group 17. It was another chapter in a service record that kept building on itself, adding texture and depth to a man whose public image would eventually be reduced to a single unforgettable movie role. For a stretch of time, it genuinely looked like Ermey's military service might stay anchored in the Pacific, far removed from the war that was tearing through an entire generation of young American men on the other side of the South China Sea. That comfortable distance didn't last. By 1968, everything about his path shifted, and the story most people think they know about R. Lee Ermey and Vietnam gets a lot more complicated from that point forward. This is the chapter people have debated the loudest and the longest. Did Ermey actually serve in Vietnam? Or was that part of his record something quietly polished up over the years to sharpen his reputation as the toughest man in any room? Some corners of the internet have treated it as an open question for decades, but the service records don't leave much room for ambiguity. In 1968, Ermey received orders to South Vietnam, deploying alongside his unit, Marine Wing Support Group 17. The documentation is clear and direct. He spent 14 months in country. That's not a quick symbolic rotation designed to put a stamp on someone's record, and it's not a brief stopover between safer assignments. 14 months is a serious stretch of time inside an active war zone, and that fact alone should settle a good portion of the argument. But the nuance surrounding what exactly he did during those 14 months is where a lot of the online speculation went sideways, pulling people toward two very different conclusions that both miss the actual story. Ermey wasn't a frontline infantry rifleman running through jungle firefights on a daily basis, the way the young recruits he'd later portray and mentor in Full Metal Jacket were. That distinction matters, and it's been twisted in both directions by people with an agenda either way. Marine Corps officials confirmed to military.com that over the course of his military career, Ermey served in roles that included both rifleman and repair shop mechanic. That combination tells you something important. It speaks to someone operating within a combat zone environment, close to the machinery and logistics that kept a war running, not someone sitting behind a desk in a secured compound hundreds of miles from any real threat. It's a combat-adjacent role, a support function inside a genuine war zone, and there's a meaningful difference between that and a frontline infantryman on daily foot patrols through contested territory. Both extremes that circulate online, the crowd that says he saw nothing worth mentioning, and the crowd that treats him as some kind of undocumented combat legend, manage to miss the more honest, documented picture sitting right in the middle. What nobody disputes, across any account or source that's looked seriously at his record, is that he was in that war zone long enough and close enough to real danger to come home with permanent physical evidence of it. Ermey was wounded in both the back and the arm during his time in Vietnam. He didn't leave that country clean. He left carrying shrapnel, and he carried it for the rest of his life. Years later, in a 1987 interview with the New York Times, he mentioned that his military career had effectively been cut short by a rocket in 1969. True to his nature, he didn't expand on that detail, didn't dramatize it, didn't turn it into a story worth retelling over cocktails. He said what happened, and he moved on. That restraint is worth noting, because it runs directly counter to the idea that Ermey exaggerated or embellished his service record for the sake of his Hollywood image. The shrapnel wasn't a publicity angle cooked up by a studio. It wasn't a detail that surfaced conveniently after Full Metal Jacket made him famous. This was known, documented, and widely acknowledged long before Kubrick ever cast him in that film. The injury predated the career. The war came first, and the acting came after, not the other way around. Think about what that actually means in practical terms. Through every role he ever played, through every drill instructor scene, every appearance on screen where he's at maximum volume and maximum intensity, through red carpet events, television interviews, live appearances, and decades of public life, Ermey was carrying a literal piece of metal inside his body from a rocket that hit in 1969. The war didn't stay in Vietnam for him. It traveled home with him and never left. When Ermey's Vietnam deployment wrapped up, the Corps didn't send him home to recover and coast. He was reassigned to Okinawa, where he continued climbing the ranks and earned a promotion to staff sergeant. He kept showing up, kept doing the work, and carried the physical toll of that deployment with him every single day, without making it anyone else's business. That kind of quiet persistence says a lot about who he was as a Marine. He didn't seek sympathy, didn't trade on his combat experience for attention, and didn't put distance between himself and the uniform the moment things got hard. He stayed in and kept going. Now, what did the Marine Corps actually confirm on the record? Because this is where years of internet speculation and second-hand claims run straight into documented fact, and the documented fact wins every time. Military.com obtained information directly from Marine Corps officials, and what they confirmed about Ermey's decoration record is worth going through carefully. His awards included 2 Good Conduct Medals, the National Defense Service Medal, the Vietnam Service Medal with Bronze Star device, the Vietnam Campaign Medal with device, the Vietnam Gallantry Cross with Palm Unit Citation, a Meritorious Unit Commendation, and the Armed Forces Expeditionary Medal. That's a real list from a real source, not a rumor passed around a forum. And it's not a ceremonial list, either. This isn't the kind of record you accumulate just by showing up and keeping your boots polished. Several of those commendations carry real weight. The Vietnam Gallantry Cross, with Palm, and the Bronze Star device on his service medal are both tied directly to combat zone activity and recognized unit performance. Those don't come from sitting behind a desk somewhere safe. Some biographical sources go a step further and also note a sharpshooter badge and a marksman badge among his qualifications. That detail matters more than people tend to realize, especially in the context of the arguments that have circulated online about what Ermey actually did and didn't do during his service. He wasn't a peripheral figure attached to a Marine unit in some administrative capacity, while real Marines did the dangerous work nearby. He trained the same way they trained, qualified with a weapon the same way they qualified, and was expected to perform in the field the same way every other Marine was expected to perform. The injuries he sustained during his service were serious enough that finishing out his career on his own terms wasn't really an option. The Marine Corps made the call for him. A number of injuries made medical retirement necessary, and he was medically discharged from active duty in 1972. This wasn't a quiet paperwork exit or a convenient early departure. His body had paid a price that the Corps couldn't overlook, and the medical record reflected that. His final rank has been described slightly differently depending on the source, which has added a layer of confusion over the years. The most consistent accounts list Staff Sergeant as his rank at the time of medical retirement. A smaller number of sources place his rank as high as Master Sergeant by 1971, during his final stretch of service in Okinawa. The specific rank notation varies a little across sources, but the core facts about his medical discharge and the reasons behind it are consistent across every documented account. That part isn't disputed. Here's the detail that tends to genuinely catch people off guard, especially those who only know Ermey from Full Metal Jacket or his later television work. During his entire active duty career, he was never a gunnery sergeant, not once. The rank he actually earned and held in the Marine Corps was Staff Sergeant. Gunnery Sergeant was never a title he wore while still in uniform, which means every assumption built on that misconception needs to be walked back. So where did Gunnery Sergeant come from? In 2002, Marine Corps Commandant General James L. Jones made a decision that had never been made before, and, as far as the record shows, hasn't been made since. He granted Ermey an honorary promotion to Gunnery Sergeant, making Ermey the only Marine in history to receive that particular distinction after already leaving active service. It wasn't a casual gesture or a Hollywood publicity arrangement. It was a deliberate, formal recognition by the highest-ranking officer in the Marine Corps at the time, extended to a man whose real service record had clearly left an impression worth honoring decades later. That single fact, quietly documented and verifiable, puts one of the most persistent rumors about Ermey to rest for good. The Gunnery Sergeant title was real. It just came from a very different place than most people assumed. A lot of people assume Hollywood simply made up his rank, that someone in a production meeting thought Gunnery Sergeant sounded right and pinned it on him for effect. The truth runs in exactly the opposite direction. The Marine Corps itself, long after Ermey had completed his active service, formally and ceremonially elevated him to that rank as a genuine tribute. It was recognition not just for what he'd done in uniform, but for everything he did afterward. The decades of publicly standing behind active duty troops through his acting career, his charity work, and his steady presence on television advocating for the military community. From Marine to Hollywood, it wasn't a clean or obvious transition. Getting medically discharged in 1972 left Ermey without a roadmap. He wasn't some fresh-faced recruit stepping off a bus for the first time, trying to figure out who he was. He was a man who had spent 11 straight years inside one of the most structured institutions on Earth, and suddenly none of that structure existed anymore. Civilian life doesn't hand you a mission briefing. It doesn't tell you where to be or what to do next. For someone who had operated within that rigid framework since his teenage years, that silence must have been genuinely disorienting. His first move after leaving the Marines wasn't exactly the stuff of highlight reels. In a 1997 interview with Entertainment Weekly, Ermey talked openly about buying a rundown bar in Okinawa, trying to build something from scratch in a place he knew from his service days. It didn't last. Japanese authorities eventually caught on to black market activity connected to the business, and Ermey had to walk away from it entirely. That chapter almost never makes it into the polished tribute pieces written about him, but it matters. It shows a man who was genuinely scrambling, trying to construct an identity outside the only world he'd ever really known, without rank, without a clear mission, and without anyone telling him what came next. Eventually, Ermey made his way to the Philippines, and that move started to change things. He began studying drama there, something he hadn't seriously pursued before, and he started picking up roles in Filipino productions. It was a slow, unglamorous start, but it put him in the right place at the right time. Director Francis Ford Coppola was filming Apocalypse Now in the region during the late 1970s, and he crossed paths with Ermey during that production. Coppola brought him on as a technical advisor, someone who could make the military elements of the film feel authentic rather than performed. Ermey also stepped in front of the camera in a small role, appearing as a helicopter pilot in the now iconic helicopter attack sequence that audiences still talk about today. This is exactly where another persistent misconception falls apart. The popular version of Ermey's story tends to compress the timeline, making it sound as though he came back from Vietnam, caught Hollywood's attention almost immediately, and stepped into a screen career while the dust was still settling. That's not what happened. There was nearly a full decade between his medical discharge in 1972 and anything resembling a real foothold in the film industry. That gap was filled with reinvention, with a failed bar in Okinawa, with drama classes in the Philippines, with bit parts in films most audiences have never seen. It was a grind, not a grand entrance. What eventually changed everything was a film called Full Metal Jacket, though not in the way most people assume. While working as a technical advisor on that production, Ermey wasn't originally considered for the role of the drill instructor at all. That part had already been cast with another actor. Ermey's job was to help with authenticity behind the scenes, including sitting in on interviews, with extras being considered for other roles. During those sessions, he started reading the drill instructor's lines himself, partly to demonstrate what the character should sound like and how that kind of authority actually moved through a room. Someone had the presence of mind to record those sessions on tape. When director Stanley Kubrick reviewed the footage, he saw something no casting process had managed to surface on its own. He pulled the original actor from the role and gave it to Ermey instead, a decision that would define both the film and Ermey's career for decades to come. Here's something that says a lot about who Lee Ermey really was. The most iconic dialogue in Full Metal Jacket, those vicious, profanity-soaked tirades that Gunnery Sergeant Hartman unleashes on his terrified recruits, reportedly came straight out of Ermey's own head. He wrote much of that material himself, without Kubrick guiding him on those specific lines. Stanley Kubrick, one of the most controlling directors in Hollywood history, essentially handed Ermey the keys to those scenes and let him run. That alone tells you how much raw authenticity the man brought to that set. The role made him a household name almost overnight. Before Full Metal Jacket, Ermey had done solid work in film and television, but nothing that burned his face into the public consciousness quite like Hartman. Suddenly, everyone knew that voice, that posture, that particular brand of terrifying authority. And the reason audiences believed every second of it was simple. The character wasn't much of a stretch. Loud, foul-mouthed, unshakable, relentlessly demanding, that was already Ermey. He wasn't acting so much as he was channeling a version of himself that he'd spent years becoming in the real Marine Corps. When Ermey died in April 2018, the response came fast. Veterans, actors, directors, and fans of Full Metal Jacket all sent tributes within hours of the news breaking. His longtime manager, Bill Rodgen, confirmed the death, stating that Ermey had passed from complications of pneumonia. That basic fact circulated quickly. What took considerably longer to surface was the deeper story, the full weight of what Vietnam had done to his body, and the extent of the formal recognition that the military establishment would eventually extend to him in the months that followed. As tributes poured in, more details began emerging through statements connected to his family and direct confirmations from Marine Corps sources. The picture that came together wasn't a revision of what people already knew. It was an expansion, a filling in of details that had always been technically available but never widely circulated during his lifetime. Ermey had never been one to sit around cataloging his own service record for public consumption. He just lived it, and the record existed whether he talked about it or not. The arrangements for his burial said something important all by themselves. In January 2019, roughly 9 months after his death, Ermey's ashes were laid to rest in Section 82 of Arlington National Cemetery. Around 100 people attended the ceremony, including friends, family members, and longtime fans who made the trip to pay their respects. The service included a military firing party, a casket team, a bugler, and the formal folding and presentation of the American flag, the full treatment reserved for those who earned it. Arlington doesn't accept everyone who applies. Eligibility is tied directly to a veteran's service record, and in many cases, to documented injury or valor connected to that service. The cemetery has strict standards, and they don't bend them for celebrity, so the fact that Ermey was buried there wasn't a gesture of goodwill toward a famous actor who once played a Marine on screen. It was a confirmation, quiet but completely clear, that his military file held up under scrutiny. His burial at Arlington was, on its own, as direct a validation of his service record as any official document. The Department of Veterans Affairs added its own public tribute around the same time, naming Ermey a Veteran of the Day. The VA's summary covered his full service window from 1961 to 1972, specifically noting his 14-month deployment to Vietnam, 2 separate tours in Okinawa, and his years working as a drill instructor shaping the next generation of Marines. They closed the tribute with a line that needed no elaboration. Semper Fi, Gunny. We honor his service. Take all of it together, and the picture becomes impossible to reasonably dispute. The medical records documenting his wounds, the medal citations confirmed by Marine Corps officials after his death, the honorary promotion to gunnery sergeant, personally authorized by a sitting commandant back in 2002, and finally, a full military honors burial inside Arlington National Cemetery. Every single piece of that record points in the same direction. Not one element contradicts another. This is what the complete story of R. Lee Ermey's military service actually looks like when you lay it all out. Not the character, not the Hollywood persona, but the man underneath both of those things. A veteran whose wounds were real, whose decorations were earned, and whose final resting place was chosen not because of his fame, but because of what he'd actually done in uniform before any camera ever pointed at him. So what does the actual record show when you cut through all the noise? Strip away the years of online speculation, the forum arguments, the skeptical comment sections, and what you're left with is a documented military career that holds up far better than the critics ever gave it credit for. The claim that R. Lee Ermey never really served in Vietnam and simply played a convincing Marine on screen doesn't survive contact with the evidence. He was formally ordered to South Vietnam in 1968, served 14 months in country with Marine Wing Support Group 17. And that fact is backed up across military records and multiple independent biographical sources. This wasn't a line recycled from old press releases. It was confirmed, repeatedly and consistently, by documentation that had nothing to do with Hollywood. Then there's the shrapnel. The claim that the wound story was invented later as a publicity angle, something cooked up by a studio to make him seem more authentic, falls apart the moment you look at the timeline. He was wounded in the back and arm while deployed in Vietnam, and he carried that shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life. This detail shows up in interviews and biographical accounts stretching back decades, long before Full Metal Jacket, long before he was a household name. If it was a fabrication, it was an extraordinarily early and consistent one. It wasn't. The question of rank is where things get genuinely interesting, and it's also where a lot of the online debate misses the point entirely. His actual earned rank during active service was Staff Sergeant. That's the factual baseline. But the gunnery sergeant distinction wasn't simply a movie title that got recycled into real life. It was awarded to him honorarily in 2002, personally approved by the sitting Marine Corps Commandant, and it came with a distinction that had never been granted before or since. He became the only Marine in recorded history to receive that specific honorary promotion after already leaving the Corps. That's not a publicity stunt. That's an institution with a fierce reputation for tradition choosing to make a single, deliberate exception. The combat question is more nuanced, and that's worth saying plainly rather than oversimplifying it in either direction. He wasn't a frontline infantryman running daily patrols through jungle terrain the way the young recruits he later trained on screen were. His documented roles, as described by Marine Corps officials themselves, were rifleman and repair shop mechanic. But he was present in an active war zone for over a year, and the deployment didn't end on schedule or quietly. It ended because he was injured, seriously enough that the wound brought his time in the field to a close. He described it himself as a rocket strike. That's not a safe posting behind the lines. That's combat close enough to leave marks. And those marks didn't go away. He carried that shrapnel quietly, without making it a centerpiece of his public identity for the remainder of his life. The Marine Corps itself, not a studio, not a publicist, confirmed the core details on the record. When the institution that issued his orders, tracked his service, and approved his honorary rank is the one vouching for the story, the burden of proof shifts pretty heavily onto anyone still arguing it was manufactured. Finally, the suggestion that his medals and commendations were padded or invented to boost his public profile doesn't hold up either. The record is what it is, and it was built long before anyone was watching. After Ermey passed, Marine Corps officials went directly on the record with military.com to confirm his complete service record and full medal list. That left no real room for debate. Whatever fans had pieced together from his film roles over the years, the official documentation told a cleaner, more complete story than any rumor ever could. And what a story it was. A teenager in serious trouble with the law, handed a stark choice by a judge, walked into the Marine Corps, and never looked back. He became a drill instructor, shaped hundreds of recruits, shipped out to Vietnam, and came home carrying shrapnel in his back that doctors never fully removed. He carried that weight, literally, for the rest of his life, and he rarely made a point of talking about it. The recognition he earned wasn't ceremonial or honorary in a hollow sense. The Commandant of the Marine Corps, the branch's highest-ranking officer, personally acknowledged Ermey and elevated him to the honorary rank of gunnery sergeant. That's not something the Corps hands out casually. It reflects a genuine regard for what a man contributed, both in uniform and in the decades that followed. When he died, the Marines didn't simply send a card or issue a statement. They brought him home. Full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, one of the most solemn and respected burial grounds in the country. That final tribute said more about how the Corps viewed R. Lee Ermey than any film credit ever could. The online rumors that circulated for years painted a muddier picture, with some claiming he exaggerated his record, and others insisting his Hollywood image was mostly fiction. The confirmed record dismantled all of that. His real biography, the verified one, was already dramatic enough to stand entirely on its own without any embellishment. That's what made Ermey's story worth telling in full. He didn't need the movies to give him credibility. He earned it, long before any casting director knew his name, in jungles and training depots and operating rooms, and he carried it quietly until the very end. Drop a like if you found it worthwhile. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive, and turn on notifications to stay in the loop. There are more stories like this one coming, where the real history turns out to be far more interesting than the legend. See you in the next one.